Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, again for coming out. I think this weekend has been a marvelous success so far. I think the speakers here have really known their stuff and really delivered some really compelling and interesting lectures on these great captains. I suppose I'm the person to blame on some of the selection here, but I think we've talked and discussed this weekend about obviously these are not the definitive great captains of American military history, but it does start a discussion and can start, obviously in these things, what you bring in the classroom, you can obviously point out whether it be character or other issues, and your students, more importantly, can determine for themselves with some historical grounding on the subject. So it's my pleasure to introduce our last speaker, Peter Mansoor, who is the Raymond E. Mason Chair in Military History at The Ohio State University. And prior to coming to Ohio State, or The Ohio State, he served a career in the United States Army, where he retired with the rank of colonel. In his career, one of his last assignments was as executive officer to General David Petraeus there. He has written a book about his time as a brigade commander in Baghdad called Baghdad at Sunrise, A Brigade Commander's War in Iraq, Yale University Press, 2008. And I'll also let you know that he is forthcoming a book called The Surge with Yale University Press that will be out later this year. Peter, thank you.
Well, like the Facebook just became Facebook because it's cleaner. It's not The Surge, but Surge. Anyway, thank you for that kind introduction, and I appreciate the Foreign Policy Research Institute inviting me to speak here today, and for Cantini for hosting. It's been a fabulous weekend. I do realize that I'm the only thing between you and lunch and or departure, and I will try to make it as painless as possible. Earlier this morning, David Eisenhower asked, what makes for a great captain? And I'm going to ask the other question, what makes for greatness? And this reminds me of one of our journeys back to Washington to testify before Congress. This was in April 2008, the third such testimony. And I was waiting for the hearings to begin. And outside in the corridor, there were three staffers talking about all the notables who were assembled inside the hearing room. And they got into this discussion about what makes for greatness in Washington. And the first one said, you're someone in Washington when you get invited for a private meeting in the Oval Office with the president. And they all sort of nodded at that. And then the second one said, well, no, that's not quite it. Greatness is when you get invited to a private meeting in the Oval Office with the president, and when the hotline rings, he ignores it because he's so wrapped on what you're saying. And they both, the other two kind of nodded. And then the third one settled it once and for all, a particularly long-serving staffer. And he said, no, that's not it. Greatness in Washington is when you get invited to a private meeting in the Oval Office, and when the hotline rings, the president answers it, holds it out, and says, here, General Petraeus, it's for you. In the summer of 2006, Iraqi insurgents destroyed a tower supporting high-voltage electrical lines linking Baghdad with southern Iraq. The attack was part of a concerted campaign to damage infrastructure and prevent the Iraqi government from stabilizing its hold on power. After food and water, nothing meant more to the Iraqi people than electricity to power the air conditioners, television sets, refrigerators, and other appliances that had flooded the country since the fall of the Ba'athist regime. It was one of many essential services that the coalition and its Iraqi partners would need to improve to enhance the legitimacy of the government. These nation-building chores were a subset of the wider array of counterinsurgency tasks performed by multinational force Iraq, soon to come under the command of General David Petraeus. All of these counterinsurgency tasks were difficult, but few turned out to be as complicated as the repair of this simple steel structure. During the 8-month saga of its restoration, Tower 57 became a metaphor for the progress of the surge, the bold gamble by President George W. Bush to reverse the downward spiral of a war that by the end of 2006 was nearly lost. The process by which General Petraeus monitored Tower 57's repair illustrates his leadership and management style, a combination of inspiration, persuasion, detailed management, and prodding that ensured his subordinates got the job done. But how General Petraeus came to be in this position in the first place requires some explanation. By late 2006, the prognosis for the war in Iraq looked bleak indeed. 3 years of drift had left U.S. and coalition forces without appropriate doctrine or an operational concept capable of defeating the insurgency that had erupted in the wake of the U.S. invasion. Ill-considered decisions to radically de-Ba'athify Iraqi society and disband the Iraqi army effectively disenfranchised large segments of the Sunni Arab community and fueled the insurgency. By 2004, the intervention of jihadists from elsewhere in the Islamic world had radicalized the insurgency and provided it with its signature weapons, suicide bombers and car bombs that would kill tens of thousands of Iraqis in an attempt to stoke the fires of sectarian hatred. The strategy worked. You can see here, by December 2006, just before the surge is implemented, by whoever's data you're using, coalition data down here, Iraqi data up here, civilians were dying by the thousands every month to ethno-sectarian violence. As insurgents battled coalition forces and the nascent Iraqi security forces, Al-Qaeda aimed its deadly violence at Shia Iraqis. In February 2006, terrorists destroyed the Al-Askari Shrine, the third most important shrine in Shia Islam, located in the Sunni Arab city of Samarra. Shiites erupted in an orgy of violence that propelled Iraq into civil war. By the end of 2006, more than 3,000 Iraqis were dying monthly from ethno-sectarian violence. Right up here. And we now know that, by the way, this line goes down, but this is what we're looking at the beginning of the surge. You know, if it's a stock chart, you're happy. As Shia militias such as the Jaish al-Mahdi swept through Baghdad in an attempt to cleanse the city of its Sunni inhabitants, Sunni communities under violent siege rallied around the insurgents and Al-Qaeda operatives who were now their defenders of last resort. Both sides in this sectarian struggle intimidated the people, preyed on them for sustenance, and brutalized those who failed to provide support. By the end of 2006, more than 1.6 million Iraqi Sunnis had fled the country, while an additional 1.5 million were internally displaced within Iraq. Simply put, Iraq was disintegrating, beginning with its capital city, Baghdad. Despite this desperate situation, the commander of coalition forces in Iraq, U.S. Army General George Casey, clung to his chosen strategy of battling the insurgency while transitioning security responsibilities to the Iraqi forces. He believed that this strategy of transition would force the Iraqi government to reconcile with its opponents, while prodding Iraqi security forces to take the lead in counterinsurgency operations. This strategy was harder to justify in the wake of increasing sectarian violence after the bombing of the Al-Askari Shrine. From 2004 to 2006, multinational force Iraq had killed more than 6,000 insurgents and detained 12,000 others, yet violence in May 2006 hit a record monthly high of nearly 3,200 attacks. Casey's forces fought with inadequate resources to implement an increasingly inappropriate strategy of transferring security responsibilities to Iraqi army and police units that were fundamentally unprepared to accept them, and in some cases were complicit in the ethno-sectarian violence now tearing the country apart. President Bush belatedly came to the conclusion that a new strategy was required to rescue a failing war effort. After a prolonged debate within the administration In early January 2007, he decided to surge reinforcements to Iraq to reverse the coalition's declining fortunes. The president also determined that a new strategy required a new and different leader to oversee the effort in Iraq. To command U.S. and coalition forces during the surge, as the new strategy was called, Bush tapped one of the U.S. Army's more unconventional leaders and thinkers, General David Petraeus. David Petraeus had spent the better part of a lifetime grooming himself for this moment. A graduate of the West Point class of 1974, Petraeus spent much of his career alternating between assignments in infantry units and high-level staff positions working for some of the top leaders in the military service. Despite the dictates of an institution that frowned on too many assignments away from troops, Petraeus found time to complete a PhD at Princeton University and to teach in the Department of Social Sciences at West Point. He nearly died twice in training accidents. Shot accidentally by one of his own soldiers on a live fire range in 1991, then Lieutenant Colonel Petraeus was saved by heart surgeon Bill Frist, later a senator from the state of Tennessee. As a colonel, Petraeus suffered a parachute accident that left him with a broken pelvis. Either of these accidents could have ended his life or career, but Petraeus' legendary physical fitness enabled him to recover quickly in both instances. He was soon back to winning push-up contests against all comers and running 6 miles a day at a blistering pace. Promoted to general officer, Petraeus spent nearly a year after 9/11 hunting war criminals in the Balkans. He followed up this assignment by assuming command of the 101st Airborne Division, which he led in the initial invasion of Iraq. This is a photo of him during that time. The Screaming Eagles ended the conventional phase of the war in northern Iraq. There, Petraeus instituted a counterinsurgency campaign that included extensive focus on economic development, rehabilitation of former Baathists, and restoration of essential services. This unconventional approach succeeded. Northern Iraq remained stable, a situation that reversed after the departure of Petraeus and the 101st Airborne, and their replacement by a force a third of the size that, simply put, had no hope of securing the vast territory under its care. Petraeus was soon back in Iraq, this time as commander of the U.S. Advisory Group, the oddly named Multinational Security Transition Command Iraq, with the even more odd acronym MNSTICI. His job was to build up the Iraqi army and police so U.S. forces and their coalition partners could leave. It was a demanding job, and Petraeus was starting virtually from scratch. The disbandment of the Iraqi army and other regime security forces in May 2003 had left little upon which to build. Especially lacking were mid-grade and senior leaders who could not be developed overnight. Quantity could not make up for quality. Furthermore, those Iraqi forces without coalition advisors often fell under the sway of hardline sectarian leaders, becoming a part of the problem instead of a solution to it. The apparent success of MNSTICI under Petraeus' leadership hid a darker reality that was to become all too apparent in the wake of the bombing of the Al-Askari Shrine in 2006. Seemingly charmed, however, Petraeus ended his second command tenure in Iraq on the cover of Newsweek magazine under the title, "Can This Man Save Iraq?" Army leaders were not amused. They're generally not amused when one of their own gets national publicity. Army culture at the general officer level rewards conformity. Good company men get promoted. Outspoken mavericks often do not. Petraeus was shunted aside to the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, an assignment that many believed would be the professional kiss of death. Now that you've all studied that cover really well. Petraeus turned the seemingly mundane job into an opportunity to reshape the U.S. way of irregular warfare. In conjunction with Marine Corps General James Mattis, Petraeus took on the challenge of reshaping American counterinsurgency doctrine. He went about doing so in a very non-traditional way by convening a conference much like this in Kansas that included not just military officers, but academics, human rights advocates, journalists, and others with knowledge of counterinsurgency warfare. Rather than rely on the cumbersome Army bureaucracy to write the doctrine, Petraeus picked one of his own West Point classmates, Dr. Conrad Crane, as its lead author. Petraeus pressed for completion of the manual with his usual energy. From conception to completion, the manual was written, sent to the field for comments, edited, and published in less than a year. Undoubtedly a record for a military doctrinal publication, especially one that would have an immediate impact on ongoing operations. The new counterinsurgency field manual attracted such attention that it was reprinted by the University Press of Chicago and reviewed in the New York Times, and within the first month had more than 1 million downloads on the web. Petraeus finished working on the doctrine not a moment too soon. 2 weeks after the counterinsurgency field manual's publication in December 2006, Petraeus received a call from Secretary of Defense Bob Gates informing him that the President had chosen Petraeus as the next commander of multinational force Iraq. Petraeus would command U.S. and coalition forces during the most difficult period of the war. In his confirmation hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee, Petraeus stated, "The situation in Iraq is dire. The stakes are high. There are no easy choices. The way ahead will be very hard. Progress will require determination and difficult U.S. and Iraqi actions, especially the latter, as ultimately the outcome will be determined by the Iraqis. But hard is not hopeless." The surge was a gamble, a point noted by President Bush in his Oval Office meeting with Petraeus shortly before the general left for Iraq. "I'm doubling down," the president stated. Petraeus replied truthfully, "This isn't double down, Mr. President. It's all in." Petraeus knew that these brigades that were being sent to Iraq were the last ones in the Army's arsenal, and if the president wanted to send more forces after this, he'd have to mobilize the reserves, which was not politically feasible. If the surge failed to arrest the spiraling violence in Iraq, the war would be lost. While the Bush administration refashioned the strategy for the Iraq War, half a world away in Iraq, significant developments were already shifting the strategic foundations of the conflict. The tribal rebellion against al-Qaeda in Iraq, known as the Awakening, was a significant turning point in the war. There had been a number of attempts to engage the tribes in Anbar province and elsewhere prior to 2006, but all the efforts had failed. At times, various groups did rebel against the excesses of al-Qaeda operatives, but each time the terrorists had ended the uprisings through excessive cruelty and violence. In the summer of 2006, when all seemed lost in Anbar province, in fact, a Marine intelligence estimate said that basically we have lost Anbar province, a tribal revolt by Sheikh Abdul Sadr Abu Risha al-Rishawi, the 35-year-old head sheikh of a minor tribe located on the outskirts of Ramadi, succeeded when U.S. forces under the command of U.S. Army Colonel Sean McFarland backed it with resources and force. Parenthetically, Sean McFarland commanded the 1st Brigade, 1st Armored Division, a unit which I commanded during the first year of the war and about which I've written a book, Baghdad at Sunrise, A Brigade Commander's War in Iraq. I turned the colors over to Sean before I left Germany, and he took the brigade to Iraq for its second tour. The tribal revolt, dubbed the Awakening, predated the surge of forces into Iraq by several months, but at the end of 2006, its ultimate success was uncertain. And this is what observers of the war do not understand when they say the tribal revolt had more impact on what happened in 2007, 2008 than military reinforcements. That was not the case at the end of 2006. As we'll see, General Petraeus' leadership and the surge had a great deal to do with the success of the Awakening. Tribal leaders calculated that it was better to ally with American forces than continue to suffer depredations under the heel of al-Qaeda. By the end of 2006, the Awakening had become an undeniable force in the Ramadi area. This political transformation changed the complexion of the Sunni insurgency, but it would require nurturing by U.S. leaders and forces to succeed. Excuse me. As these events were unfolding in Iraq, Petraeus carefully selected the members of his personal staff who would work most closely with him in the execution of the surge, and I had a large role in helping him to form his team as his incoming executive officer and the head of his transition team. He looked for two things in prospective staff members: intellectual ability and experience on the ground in Iraq. Physical fitness, a requirement if one was to aspire to keep up with the general on his lengthy runs conducted at a blistering pace, was a plus. Petraeus chose an eclectic group, including 2 Rhodes Scholars, 2 PhDs, a Jordanian-born Palestinian-American who had been educated by Mennonites, and an Australian lieutenant colonel who was currently working as a counterterrorism advisor for the U.S. State Department. You could add up the class ranks of the key individuals in Petraeus' inner circle and not run out of fingers on 2 hands. All of the personal staff had at least one previous tour of duty in Iraq. And going back to the class rank thing, and to show you a bit about General Petraeus' personality, the speechwriter Liz McNally was a Rhodes Scholar, and when she left Iraq, we had to find a replacement, and we found a replacement in Erica Borgren, who is also a Rhodes Scholar, member of West Point class, and she had graduated number 2 in her class. And when I introduced her to General Petraeus and said, and she's a Rhodes Scholar and graduated number 2 in her class at West Point, Petraeus' comment to her was, "What went wrong?" Petraeus took command of Multinational Force Iraq in a ceremony in the Al-Faw Palace at Camp Victory on February 10th, 2007. The next day, he conducted his first patrol outside the wire to assess conditions in Baghdad, and that's an actual photo of him right as we took off on the patrol. In the West Baghdad neighborhoods of Ghazali and Dora, Petraeus was stunned by what he saw. The once vibrant Sunni neighborhoods had become virtual ghost towns, and a palpable sense of fear hung over the people. He realized then that conditions in Iraq were much worse than he had been led to believe or expected. Time was not an ally. He had to do what he could to reverse the downward spiral in security in Iraq before the time left on the Washington clock ran out. In other words, before the will of the American people, as represented by their elected representatives in Congress, gave out. General Petraeus believed the primary task of a senior leader was to get the big ideas right, to communicate them across and down the chain of command, and then to supervise their implementation. The biggest of the big ideas during the surge was a shift in priorities for U.S. forces from killing and capturing insurgent and terrorist operatives to protecting the Iraqi people, an idea that corresponded with the newly published Counterinsurgency Doctrine, Field Manual 23-4. From 2003 to 2006, U.S. forces had adapted to the environment in Iraq, but not in a uniform manner. General Petraeus and his operational level partner, Multinational Corps Iraq Commander Lieutenant General Ray Odierno, now the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, forced a coherent operational construct to take hold across the force, and thereby cemented into place standard counterinsurgency principles throughout Iraq. Protection of the population became not just one of many competing priorities, but the priority for U.S. forces. And I think there's a great parallel here in what General Abrams did in Vietnam, as you just heard from Bob Sorley. To accomplish this goal, U.S. forces moved off their large forward operating bases and positioned into smaller joint security stations and combat outposts in the neighborhoods where Iraqis lived and worked. Local outposts enabled troops to patrol neighborhoods on foot, as you see here in this photo. And provide thereby an enduring presence in these neighborhoods, something that soldiers merely driving along the streets in Humvees could not do. The battle for Baghdad would take top priority, as it had previously, But in 2007, there would finally be enough forces to both clear insurgent and militia-infested neighborhoods and then to hold them against the reintroduction of hostile forces. This change in emphasis came at just the right time, and it made a huge impact on local security throughout those areas of Iraq in which U.S. forces operated. Operation Fard al-Qanun, which is Arabic for enforcing the law, kicked off just after Petraeus assumed command in Iraq. U.S. and Iraqi soldiers partnered together to win back the streets and secure Baghdad. Surge brigades arrived one per month beginning in January 2007. Some headed to Baghdad, while others positioned in the Baghdad belts, rural areas surrounding the capital that until now had served as terrorist and insurgent sanctuaries. The next 5 months served as a shaping period as Petraeus and Odierno repositioned forces, moved units into Iraqi communities, built gated communities in Baghdad by erecting miles of blast barriers and numerous checkpoints, and cleared portions of the Iraqi capital city. Decisive offensive operations would begin in June, something that our own lawmakers did not understand, as the head of the U.S. Senate, Senator Harry Reid from the state of Nevada, in April 2007, just 3 months into the surge, said the surge has failed and the war is lost. And this before we even had all the surge brigades on the ground and before we began the decisive phase of the surge operations. The other big idea that General Petraeus promulgated was to support the awakening with the full power of his command. This is General Petraeus, by the way, with Sheikh Abu Risha al-Rishawi, Sheikh Sadr. After assuming command of MNFI in February 2007, General Petraeus decided to throw its resources into an effort to facilitate the awakening spread across Anbar province and into other areas of Iraq. His decision would have an immediate and substantial impact on the conflict. By the summer of 2007, U.S., Iraqi, and tribal forces had cleared much of Anbar province of insurgent forces. But victory or defeat in Iraq required U.S. forces, along with their Iraqi military and police and tribal allies, to secure Baghdad and its environs and destroy terrorist sanctuaries elsewhere in Iraq. The experience of Ramadi had shown that such stability could be achieved via the bottom-up engagement of tribes and other Sunni groups, and not just through the pursuit of a grand political bargain at the national level, something that was not in the offing. General Petraeus realized that his forces could not kill or capture their way to victory. The key, rather, was to find those who could be reconciled and convince them to support the government while targeting the irreconcilables for killing or capture. Upon the recommendation of his deputy commander, Lieutenant General Graham Lamb from the United Kingdom, Petraeus created a forced strategic engagement cell to seek out opportunities to dialogue with insurgent and militia leaders. Lamb suggested this based on his own experience in Northern Ireland. He looked at General Petraeus and he said, "You guys have it all wrong. You're trying to reconcile with people who are already your friends. You say you're not going to talk to people with blood on their hands. Those are the people you need to talk to. The other people are already your friends." And Petraeus said, "You're right." And then he formed that forced strategic engagement cell and put a British leader in charge of it. Petraeus also encouraged units to strike local deals with various groups and to create armed neighborhood watch organizations, initially termed Concerned Local Citizens, but later referred to by the much more dignified title Sons of Iraq, after General Petraeus' senior advisor and his interpreter told him that concerned local citizens, when translated into Iraq, basically meant nervous local citizens. And, you got to take the local culture into account. Petraeus attempted to convince the Iraqi government to embrace these organizations as the key to defeating al-Qaeda, which indeed they were, but with mixed results. The Shia political elite were willing to concede some authority to Sunnis in largely Sunni areas, such as Al-Anbar province in western Iraq, but balked at supporting armed Sunni organizations in mixed sectarian areas closer to Baghdad. Nevertheless, by the end of the surge, more than 100,000 armed Iraqi citizens, most but not all Sunni Arabs, augmented the security capabilities of coalition and Iraqi forces and provided an enormous boost to local security in various areas of Iraq. General Petraeus established his operating rhythm during his first few months in command. He established a close working relationship with the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Ryan Crocker, shown here. This is Ali Kaderi, an advisor to Ryan Crocker. This is Saadi Othman, the senior advisor to General Petraeus, a Palestinian-American. And this is another Palestinian-American who you might recognize in his glory days. Their relationship, the relationship between Petreaus and Crocker, was critical to the successful execution of the new strategy. Although unity of command is the ideal for military and civilian agencies participating in a counterinsurgency operation, during the Iraq War, the civil-military command structure divided responsibilities between Multinational Force Iraq and the U.S. Embassy. The civil-military relationship between these two entities improved dramatically under Ambassador Crocker, who supervised political, economic, and diplomatic matters, and General Petraeus, who was responsible for security issues. Their strong partnership was essential to the creation of effective unity of purpose and effort during the surge. Equally as important to the success of the surge as the Crocker-Petraeus relationship was the relationship between General Petraeus and Lieutenant General Odierno, the operational level commander of Multinational Corps Iraq. They had quite different personalities. Petraeus introspective and cerebral, Odierno extroverted and outwardly emotional. General Petraeus enjoyed a good debate, while Lieutenant General Odierno could chew you out in one moment and then give you a big bear hug in the next, and I've experienced that on more than one occasion, which could be quite an experience given his 6-foot, 5-inch frame and lineman's build. In fact, he was a lineman for the Army football team. They had served together as division commanders in Iraq in 2003-2004, during which time they had used radically different approaches to fight the insurgency in their areas. But in Odierno's defense, he had a much different area, the heartland of the Sunni Triangle, if you will, than Petraeus had up north in Mosul. Since that time, they had trod different paths, but had reached the same conclusion. Protecting the Iraqi people was the key to winning the war in Iraq. Petraeus would tackle the challenges of the war from his strategic perch, while Odierno handled the tactical and operational fight. General Petraeus worked the communications and coordination upward with the Iraqi government, the Bush administration, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and U.S. Central Command, and outward with coalition military partners, NATO, and occasionally with regional countries as well. While General Odierno focused on defeating the Sunni insurgency and containing Shia militias inside Iraq, albeit with constant dialogue with General Petraeus, who often provided guidance as well. Their relationship was professional and based on mutual respect. The nation was indeed well served by this leadership combination for the prosecution of the surge, which might have failed had less talented officers been at the helm. The dynamic duo. General Petraeus kept a tight schedule. He would wake up at 5 a.m. to work out, after which he would read a large binder of intelligence assessments and read email while eating breakfast. He would then drive into headquarters for the 7:30 a.m. Battlefield Update and Assessment, or BUA in military terminology. The BUA was a large command and staff conference that included representatives from all the various staff sections and commands in Iraq. 6 days out of the week, General Petraeus presided over the meeting from his headquarters at Camp Victory. On Thursdays, we would fly to the Green Zone, where General Petraeus would convene the BUA from the Republican Palace. The latter location enabled the participation of some of the U.S. Embassy staff in the BUA, which on this day of the week would focus largely on non-security matters, such as oil production, electricity, agriculture, and other government functions for which the U.S. Embassy had the lead. And yes, Tower 57. Despite this division of labor, Multinational Force Iraq, with its enormous capacity, assisted in efforts to improve these non-security areas. They therefore came under the purview, if not the control, of General Petraeus. He and Crocker created interagency fusion cells to deal with the big issues of governance and economics, such as oil exports and electrical power. 4 years into the conflict, the U.S. Embassy and multinational force Iraq had finally integrated their functions. General Petraeus could quickly digest the contents of a slide while listening to the narrative commentary delivered by a briefer. But he understood that absorption of data did not equal understanding. Multinational Force Iraq had created dozens of metrics prior to the surge, but not all of them were useful or equally important. General Petraeus focused on the most important issues, particularly the rate of ethno-sectarian violence that was ripping Iraq apart. He would weigh in with guidance as various topics were discussed. In some cases, the discussion would lead to the need for more information, which he would then task to the appropriate agency or staff section in the form of a new slide. PowerPoint slides were a tool to allow General Petraeus to drill down into issues, emphasize priorities, and impart guidance. This was his primary way of monitoring the broader issues affecting the command. Email was another major medium for the exchange of information on which General Petraeus relied heavily. He preferred email to phone conversations because it was quicker, could engage multiple recipients at once, and left a written record of the exchange that could be archived for future reference. Something for everyone to take note of when they rail against email. It is actually much more efficient than phone calls. General Petraeus also used email to flatten the organization. He would accept messages from anyone with something valuable to say, even occasionally from a soldier or a non-commissioned officer in the ranks. He would also cultivate bright officers who held important positions throughout the command. These trusted back-channel confidants acted as a feedback mechanism and enabled General Petraeus to get a feel for the thinking at lower echelons. When he retired to his quarters for the evening, a bedroom in a villa across the lake from the MNFI headquarters that had previously belonged to Saddam Hussein's mother, he would continue to send and receive emails well into the evening. He would then read for a few minutes each night before going to sleep. And by the way, my bedroom was right next to his, so we were tied at the hip for most of 15 months. Twice a week, General Petraeus would visit units in the field to keep abreast of what lower echelons were doing and thinking, and to impart his vision and intent directly to them. He would also conduct lengthy six-mile runs 3 times a week, even in the heat of the Middle Eastern summer. And here I'll just state that during my farewell from the command after 15 months with General Petraeus, I gave a sort of a David Letterman top 10 major accomplishments during my time in Iraq. And number one, when I got down to it, was that I beat General Petraeus every Tuesday afternoon on his 6-mile run by cutting 2 miles off the course, which is true. And I would barely beat him. I'd run 4, he'd run 6. When he hired me, I had heard about his legendary runs, you know, how he breaks his new staff officers, everyone. It was standard. And I have a bad lower back, so I had a medical profile where I could run at my own pace and distance. And I said, you know, he asked me at the end of the interview, do you have any questions? And I said, well, just a comment, and that is, if you're going to take me on one of your brutal runs, you might as well fire me now and hire someone else, because I can't do it. And he goes, whoa, calm down, Pete. He goes, I didn't hire you for your body. Don't worry. General Petraeus' frequent visits to the field enabled Petraeus to meet and talk with every brigade commander and the vast majority of the battalion commanders in Iraq during their deployments. These trips kept him informed of the progress of the counterinsurgency campaign, gave him an opportunity to impart guidance and advice, and kept him in touch with the troops. During unit visits, General Petraeus would meet privately with groups of company commanders, captains, to listen to what they had to say about their ongoing operations. He would often come away with these meetings with ideas on how his command could improve its support for these small units at the sharp end of the spear. He would also interact with the Iraqi people on market walks, engaging them in pleasantries with his limited Arabic and more in depth through his translators. These outings gave General Petraeus a more granular feel for what was happening on the ground in Iraq. General Petraeus wasted no minute. In his mind, helicopter flights were just another opportunity to work on email, with a communications sergeant handing him a fully updated laptop computer upon takeoff, and another downloading the laptop into the network upon landing. He would also sometimes order his pilots to fly over various neighborhoods in Baghdad so that he could gauge for himself such things as the disparity between Sunni and Shia areas, the number of civilians out shopping or at amusement parks, the provision of electricity to neighborhoods, kids playing soccer, and the like. These flights were not a replacement for on-the-ground reconnaissance, but they were nonetheless useful as another indicator of the effect of the surge on Baghdad. The interface of politics and military operations was never far from General Petraeus' mind. This is not a sign, as some people opined, of political ambition or publicity seeking. He understood that politics is at the core of warfare. If President Bush came to understand this reality intuitively after much trial and error, General Petraeus understood it intimately from a long career of service, education, and self-study in military affairs and history. Their relationship, too, would determine whether or not the surge would succeed in the end. As with President Abraham Lincoln during the agonizing trial of the American Civil War, President Bush took several years to find his general. The analogy was apt. The most important book that General Petraeus read while serving in Iraq was Grant Takes Command by Civil War historian Bruce Catton, which had a huge influence on him. The president knew intuitively what he wanted from the military in Iraq, but for too long he failed to articulate his vision to his senior military leaders. In fact, President Bush sought victory, even though he was reluctant to use this word after the unfurling of the Mission Accomplished banner on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln in May 2003. He had initially defined success in expansive terms, lofty pronouncements about bringing freedom and democracy to the Iraqi people. The strategy of transition was a way for the United States to gracefully exit the Iraq conflict, but this was not the objective that was President Bush's primary concern. He wanted to win, and by doing so, to reshape the face of the Middle East. He was willing to back General Casey's strategy of transition until it was clear that the strategy was failing. At that point, President Bush stepped in to craft a new strategy and appoint a different military leader to implement it. One could argue that this goal was too broad and not within the capabilities of the U.S. and Iraqi militaries to achieve. But this critique is beside the point. If a military commander believes the mission is unachievable given the missions at his disposal, he should say so. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and General George Casey never asked Bush for a larger number of reinforcements because they believed they had sufficient forces in Iraq to accomplish their mission. General Petraeus, on the other hand, believed more force was needed to win the war. He demanded the entire complement of surge forces, and indeed continued to press for additional enabling forces even as the surge progressed. He believed that his duty was to analyze the mission and then request the resources he believed were necessary to accomplish it. If someone above him in the chain of command decided to withhold some or all of those resources, then his duty also compelled him to spell out the risks these shortfalls would entail. Petraeus never deviated from this belief, despite pressure from his military superiors to recommend an early end to the surge. And indeed, at one point, Admiral Fallon, the head of U.S. Central Command, was thinking about denying reinforcements to General Petraeus that General Petraeus requested. And he called him on the phone, and General Petraeus said, "With all due respect, sir, please tell the President that you've denied me reinforcements that I have requested." He got the reinforcements. President Bush and Secretary Gates were both exceptionally supportive. They understood that additional assets were required to implement a fully resourced counterinsurgency strategy, and they were willing to commit them in the quest for victory. In weekly written reports to the Secretary of Defense and video teleconference meetings with the President and his war cabinet, General Petraeus also made clear that even with the additional forces allocated to Iraq, the surge was still a high-risk strategy, albeit the best one available to salvage victory from near certain defeat. The definition of victory itself needed to be relooked, with democracy giving way to a representative form of government the Iraqis could live with and which would lead to sustainable stability in the near future rather than some sort of vision of a Jeffersonian democracy. Reconciliation among Iraqi sects, ethnicities, and factions that would lead to a full-blown functioning democracy was a generational project, as indeed it still is. Nevertheless, unless the surge succeeded, any chance of setting Iraq on the road towards this goal would be stillborn. President Bush spoke directly with Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus in Baghdad via weekly video teleconferences. Through this medium, the President was able to impart his orders and intent directly to those senior officers most intimately involved in fighting the war in Iraq, rather than having his guidance filtered, and potentially diluted through several layers of command. Given the lukewarm support of the Joint Chiefs and U.S. Central Command for the surge, this method was both essential and appropriate. Some commentators have decried this direct communication, incorrectly claiming that the President was jumping the chain of command. In fact, the entire chain of command was present at these meetings. The President, Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, National Security Advisor, and others from the White House Situation Room, along with Admiral Fallon from U.S. Central Command in Tampa. Executive branch officials were not the only government leaders interested in the Iraq War. Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus also received a constant stream of congressmen and senators from both parties desiring a first-hand look at the surge. The ambassador and the commanding general would personally brief each delegation of visitors, arrange for meetings with high-ranking Iraqi officials, and coordinate visits to meet with troops at their bases or occasionally on the streets of Baghdad. Given the high profile of some legislators, these visits and the subsequent press conferences would sometimes make national news and caused Secretary Gates at one point to state in a video teleconference, "I hope with all the visitors you've had recently, you're finding time to fight the war." General Petraeus also felt it was his duty to communicate with the American people and other audiences, and indeed President Bush highly encouraged him to do so. This imperative required a deft public affairs touch, which General Petraeus had developed over the years. General Petraeus stressed the need for speed to beat the insurgents to the headlines, to be first with the truth. Petraeus would also conduct extensive media engagements when he traveled back to the United States for congressional testimony in order to answer more fully questions from all sides of the political spectrum. By the summer of 2007, Petraeus' diligence and hard work began to pay off in a big way. In mid-June 2007, with all the surge brigades on the ground, Multinational Corps Iraq launched Phantom Thunder, an operation to clear insurgents out of the various areas of the capital city, the Baghdad belts, and Baqaba. The offensive successfully put the insurgency on the run. After several months of increasing violence in Iraq, as shaping operations set the conditions for a major offensive, the summer of 2007 witnessed a dramatic decrease in violence as the surge took effect. Progress continued even further after Muqtada al-Sadr declared a ceasefire for the Jaish al-Mahdi, which had been guilty of inciting internecine violence in the holy city of Karbala during a major religious festival in late August. Perhaps the most dramatic event of the surge came in September 2007, when General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker flew back to Washington for testimony before Congress. Speaking to skeptical congressmen and senators during 2 days of marathon hearings, Petraeus and Crocker laid out the case for continued U.S. involvement in Iraq. The surge was succeeding in lowering violence, and in time, they argued, the improvement in security would enable Iraqi politicians to deal with the very difficult issues that divided their communities. It was a tough sell, but despite the allegations of MoveOn.org, which sponsored a repugnant attack against General Petraeus in the New York Times on the morning of his initial testimony. The metrics showing a significant downward trend in violence were clear. There would be no precipitous U.S. withdrawal from Iraq. And oh, by the way, the allegations that he was a mouthpiece for the White House was put to the lie when General Petraeus was asked, well, who wrote your testimony? And he put his thumb behind at those of us sitting behind. The two authors initially were myself and his speechwriter, Liz McNally. And then we gave him the draft. Actually, there was a committee of folks like Charlie Miller and Mike Bell's predecessor, Bill Rapp, who had written an initial draft, which was typical product written by committee, unreadable. So Liz and I took it from them, fashioned it into pretty much the testimony. We gave it to him. He added to it extensively and reshaped it. And then a day before his testimony before Congress, he was in a murder board reading his testimony. It was 45 minutes long. And everyone said, that's not going to work. You can't take more than 25 minutes. And I said, well, sir, give me the testimony. Liz and I will go back and work on it. In 2 hours, we cut it from 47 minutes down to 25. So you want to tell your students why it's important to pay attention to English class? There you go. Anyway, all right, but I digress. By the winter of 2008, the surge had seriously damaged al-Qaeda in Iraq and suppressed the Sunni insurgency. The solidification of security gains made since early 2007, however, required dealing with the Shia side of the security equation, represented by the Jaish al-Mahdi and the various special groups sponsored by Iran. The latter organizations were especially lethal, using explosively formed penetrators to destroy armored vehicles and kill soldiers. In an unexpected move in March 2008, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki launched a military operation to clear the Jaish al-Mahdi out of the oil-rich city of Basra in southern Iraq. Dubbed Charge of the Knights, the operation was arguably as important as the Awakening, for it changed the calculations of Iraq's political elite and re-energized national politics. Much like the Awakening witnessed Sunni militants opposed by Sunni tribesmen, the Basra operation pitted a largely Shia Iraqi military under the command of a Shia prime minister against Shia militiamen. By confronting Shia militias in Basra and later in Sadr City and then Amara, Maliki cleared the way for a provisional resolution of the civil war that had gripped Iraq since the spring of 2006. His bold action, one that admittedly only succeeded due to the provision of substantial support from General Petraeus and Multinational Force Iraq, convinced the Iraqi political elite that religion, while a strong influence in Iraqi society, was not necessarily the determining factor in the country's political future. Once they cleared this conceptual hurdle, politics based on mutual interests rather than sect and ethnicity became possible. By mid-July 2008, when the final surge brigade withdrew from Iraq, the security situation had stabilized. Over here is January 2004, the level of attacks, about 200 per week. That was right after we caught Saddam Hussein and had defeated the first insurgent Ramadan offensive. You draw a line from there over to the end of the surge in 2008, and it's roughly the same number of attacks. And it's no coincidence that here we had an opportunity for politics to become operative, and we blew it by not reaching out to the Sunnis. And here we had the same opportunity, and the situation was reversed when we made an outreach to the Sunnis, we being both the coalition and the Iraqi government. This is what the surge did. Al-Qaeda in Iraq had been reduced considerably in size and capability, and Shia militias had been reined in. Tired of conflict, Iraqis of all sects and ethnicities decided to move the contest for power and resources to the ballot box in the hope that the next set of elections would usher in a government more fully representative of their interests. Regrettably, the endgame has not worked out for the betterment of the Iraqi people, but the Iraqi state, on the verge of collapsing in 2006, has remained intact. General Petraeus had prepared professionally, personally, and perhaps most importantly, intellectually, his entire career for the moment that he would be called upon by the President to lead American forces as a four-star commander. He was the right person for the difficult job of commanding U.S. and coalition soldiers during the critical period of the surge. On emotionally draining days when several soldiers were killed or when terrorists slaughtered large numbers of civilians, Petraeus would recall Grant's reply to Major General William Tecumseh Sherman after the particularly rough first day at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. Late at night under a tree in pouring rain, Sherman found Grant chewing on a cold cigar. "Well, Grant," Sherman intoned, "we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" "Yep," Grant replied. "Lick 'em tomorrow, though." Grant's response became our rallying cry in Iraq, as coalition forces absorbed difficult blows, recovered, and took the fight to the enemy. By the force of his energy, his will, and his intellect, General Petraeus turned around a flagging war effort. There were indeed tough days in Iraq, but he never projected anything other than a confident outlook to the officers and soldiers under his command. In setting the right tone, he made those around him believe that victory was indeed possible. Parenthetically, and with a much cruder sense of history, when I left Iraq in May 2008, after 15 months of combat duty, to go to The Ohio State University in my current position, I sent an email to General Petraeus in which I didn't quote Grant or Sherman, but I quoted Bobby Knight. "When my life in this world is done and my days on earth have passed, I hope they bury me upside down so my critics can kiss my ass." His reply was a simple, "Lick 'em tomorrow, Pete." 10 days after General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker's testimony to Congress in September 2007, Tower 57 was repaired. The completion of this task had progressed down a long and winding road. An initial effort by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to outsource the repair to an Iraqi civilian company went nowhere when insurgents threatened the management. The basic problem was security. Tower 57 was in a rural area known as the Triangle of Death that was rife with roadside bombs and easily targeted by mortars and snipers. Multinational Corps Iraq could have accomplished the mission by itself, but senior leaders rightly concluded that it would be best to force the Iraqi government to take charge of the repair effort. The effort languished as the Iraqi bureaucracy argued over which agency should accomplish the job. 3 times the Iraqi army sent a platoon of soldiers to protect the work crew assigned to fix the tower, but each time insurgent fire led the civilians to flee the scene. Frustrated senior leaders amped up the pressure, which led the Iraqi Ministry of Electricity to demand that American leaders guarantee complete security for its repair crews. In the end, the repair effort took the combined labors of a battalion of Iraqi infantry, supported by a platoon of Apache attack helicopters, an engineer team with special equipment to detect and clear roadside bombs, and a 10-man repair crew. 11 Iraqi soldiers were wounded in the operation, which took 4.5 days to complete. The significance of the repair of Tower 57 went well beyond the restoration of a 400 kilovolt electrical line from southern Iraq to Baghdad. Tower 57 had become a symbol of U.S. and Iraqi determination to defeat the insurgency and a metaphor for General Petraeus' resolve to win the war. It would have been easy enough to reroute the power grid around Tower 57 and leave it at that. But by forcing the issue, General Petraeus sent a message to Americans and Iraqis alike. We would not forego doing difficult things just because they were hard. Hard, after all, was not hopeless. Thank you very much.
Hi, Mark Yanaway from Wamogo High School in Connecticut. In my last deployment, I was in Djibouti, where we support what could be called a proxy war, using Ugandan, Burundian, Kenyan, and Ethiopian troops. Could the sons of Iraq be called American support of a proxy war in Iraq, and it gets to a bigger question, is that sort of war, I think the United States is headed that way, is it an appropriate response to insurgency?
This is what the Iraqi government was concerned about, that the Sons of Iraq would somehow become a Sunni militia opposed to the government. General Petraeus actually worked with the government and the Sons of Iraq to make sure that that didn't happen. The chain of command of the Sons of Iraq initially went through U.S. commanders to MNFI and then across to the Iraqi government. Eventually, they were transitioned to Iraqi control. And the golden rule applies. He who has the gold makes the rules. He who paid the Sons of Iraq controls them. And we were their paymaster. And then we eventually transitioned that responsibility as well to the Iraqi government. We also told the Iraqi government it's better to have these guys inside the tent than outside. And by creating the Sons of Iraq, we took biometric data, fingerprints, iris scans, and so forth. So if they turn against you, you know who they are this time. The hardest thing in a counterinsurgency is to figure out who the enemy is. Well, if they turn against you, you've got all sorts of data on them now. So we worked hard to make sure that they were not our proxies, that they were in effect, or that they were in fact a solution to the problem and not the creation of another problem. And what we did basically is everyone ganged up on Al-Qaeda, which is why Al-Qaeda at the end of the surge was nearly defeated. And the reason it's not today is because of our missteps in succeeding years, which I'd be happy to address if anyone wants to hear more on that, not because of somehow the failings of the surge. I don't know if that answers you. Oh, the second part is this an appropriate way to wage war? You know, proxy warfare is what's happening around the world today. Iran uses proxies extensively. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Jaish al-Mahdi special groups, that's their way of war, if you will. In some cases, it's appropriate. In some cases, it's not.
I'd like to hear more.
So the surge succeeded, security improved, and in fact, in the elections of 2009 and 2010, Sunnis who had boycotted previous elections voted at a greater rate percentage-wise than Shia. And so finally we had everyone deciding to take the conflict over power and resources to the ballot box rather than fight it with bombs and bullets. Well, the winner of the national elections in 2010 was Iyad Alawi, who was a Sunni. I'm sorry, he was a Shia, but he represented a non-sectarian coalition which included all the Sunni parties. And he should have had the first opportunity to form a government. And we simply blew it. We allowed Iran to outmaneuver us and convinced ourselves that Maliki would be a better choice, and we put pressure on the Iraqis to allow Maliki to form a government, which he did. Well, that told the Iraqis that somehow the ballot box didn't determine who was going to be the government, that it was the smoke-filled rooms that determined who was going to be prime minister. And they lost faith. The Sunnis once again lost faith in the system. And Maliki's actions since then have deepened their concerns. He assassinates political opponents. He's taking more and more power onto himself. And we then compounded our error by not forcing the issue to enable U.S. troops to remain. People ask me, why should we keep 1,000 troops in Iraq? That's 1,000 or 100,000. That's 100,000 points of leverage with the Iraqi government. It is no coincidence that the moment the last U.S. soldier crossed the border from Iraq into Kuwait, Maliki tried to arrest Tariq al-Hashimi, his primary political opponent on the Sunni side, because we had lost our leverage with the Iraqi government. And it's our own doing. And it's because we have a president who does not believe in this war. He was elected on an anti-war platform. And I believe he blew the end game. And it's just the way it is. So does Michael Gordon and Bernard Traynor, by the way. It's not just me.
I was curious. I'm fascinated by the use of technology in this particular manner to communicate and to get the message, for General Petraeus to get the message up from the bottom and also to communicate the message up to the top. Do you think, it seems to me that he was able to be much, much more effective as a leader on the ground because of his relationship with the president and that constant contact. Do you think that that made his job much more streamlined, or?
It was absolutely the case that the relationship between President Bush and General Petraeus enabled General Petraeus to be more effective, mainly because had he not had that constant and direct line of communication to the president, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the head of U.S. Central Command, Admiral William Fallon, were not believers in the surge. And in fact, they did try to stymie him on several occasions. And I think that you would have seen a far different outcome had President Bush not stepped in to actually become the commander-in-chief rather than the cheerleader-in-chief and have that direct line of communication with General Petraeus. I'm thinking back on previous wars, though. This is a dual-edged sword. Imagine if President Johnson had a VTC to talk to Westmoreland, or it probably would have been okay with FDR and Eisenhower, but I mean, we're in a different kind of world. And this is something that, your students would probably be interested in, the difference between commanding in World War II and commanding today with all the technology we have. And you have to, as a commander, you have to take much more care to make sure your senior leaders are informed constantly. And the demands of the media as well, with 24/7 news coverage and the blogosphere and so forth. It's just a different world, and you need someone with the skill of General Petraeus to navigate it. And when you don't, you get different outcomes, not always positive.
Fascinating presentation. I've got a factual question, and then I'd ask for a comment. The factual question is, where was the origin of the surge, and did General Petraeus, while he was out at Leavenworth, lobby in any way at all for a surge solution to the rising violence in Iraq? That's sort of the factual point. And then I'd like you to comment on the dynamics within the uniformed military. If the theater commander, Admiral O'Fallon, doesn't like the surge, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff are not in favor of the surge, is it appropriate for a more junior general officer, 3-star or 4-star, to pursue that strategy up to the commander-in-chief, nevertheless, and have it implemented over the advice of the legally constituted senior military advisor to the president?
The surge, after it succeeded, had 1 million fathers. Defeat is an orphan. But there were several groups that were working on looking at strategy in Iraq. I was involved in an effort, about 15 U.S. Army, Air Force, and Marine colonels and Navy captains, known as the Council of Colonels, helping the Joint Chiefs rethink the strategy for the Iraq War. That effort did not create the surge. All we did was help broaden their thinking about it. There was a group at the State Department led by David Satterfield, which didn't amount to much. The real effort was in the National Security Council, led by Steve Hadley, Megan O'Sullivan, and so forth. And it was aided by one of the few times that a think tank actually has an immediate impact on policy. Fred Kagan and retired General Jack Keane and the American Enterprise Institute crafted a document entitled Choosing Victory. And they got entree into the office of the vice president. General Keane saw Cheney, and then Cheney invited Keane to meet the president. And the president met with 4 guys that day in early December in the Oval Office. It was Keane, Barry McCaffrey, there was the ex-head of Special Operations Command, whose name escapes me, and then Elliot Cohen. And Elliot and H.R. McMaster and I had breakfast that morning in D.C., and he looked at HR and me, he said, okay, so what should I tell the president? And I'm like, well, we talked, and basically what Elliot Cohen said is there needs to be accountability for failure, because that's all about his book, supreme command, and that's what he talks about in his book. I don't know what McCaffrey and the other person said, but Keane said, we need to win this war, and you need to reinforce Iraq to do it. And now, the interesting thing is a lot of authors make a big deal about Keane's influence on the president, but in the president's own memoirs, Decision Points, which I like a lot, he does not mention General Keane at all, or that meeting. He credits Hadley and the National Security Council group with influencing his thinking. But be that as it may, that's the genesis of the surge. Petraeus did not have an influence on the development of the surge, other than having a back-channel line of communication to Megan O'Sullivan, who is the senior advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan on the National Security Council staff. And the one thing she asked him is, if we surge, how many troops should we send? And Petraeus said, everything you have. And so that was his only input to the surge, was a hypothetical question. Now, is it appropriate for leaders to or argue for things in contravention of what their chain of command's arguing? Sometimes it is. In this case, this is not one of those cases. Petreaus was not involved in the creation of the surge, and in the execution of the surge, his point, my point, to all my fellow colonels working for those 4 stars, is your bosses need to talk to the president. The president has decided on the strategy, and your bosses need to fall in line with the president, not somehow pressure General Petraeus to change strategy or to somehow influence the president to change strategy. The strategy's decided, and if you don't like it, you go back to the person who decided on the great decider, George W. Bush. And what was amazing to me working at that echelon is that we could have senior leaders push against what the president had ordered because they didn't believe in it. They were the ones who you should ask that question to, in my view. So I know it's not a complete answer, but yeah. Well, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed this weekend.